Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature, and today you can see we have come south to Atlanta, my hometown. It's fitting that we've come to Atlanta, the site of a major Civil War battle, because, like the Civil War in the United States, our subject for today, the Book of Kings, is the story of a secession. The Book of Kings is going to tell us how one nation became two, and then eventually became none, as both kingdoms, the North and the South, were conquered. As we've done with other books, we're going to proceed in three stages. First, we're going to perform a synchronic survey. We're going to outline the text and identify the major salient themes that we see on a first reading of the final form. Then we're going to look and see what inferences can we make from the text. What can we pull out of it? And then finally, we're going to pose some questions that linger in our mind. First, let's look at our synchronic survey. And here I want to return to a slide that I showed several classes ago when we looked at the entirety of the Deuteronomistic history. You can see the narration time dedicated to different phases of the Book of Kings. I've colored in blue the parts of this chart that refer to the Book of Kings. And the first thing that strikes me as I read Kings is how the narration slows down and speeds up. It alternates pace based on how much attention the inspired author wants to devote to certain characters. So let's zoom in a little bit more just on Kings. And you can see on this chart, we've got the main figures in each major block. We have 11 chapters that are focused principally on Solomon. Then we have 5 chapters that focus on Jeroboam and his dynasty and the aftermath at a much quicker pace. And then we have this big central block that covers the end of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings. It's focused, yes, on Ahab and Jezebel and their successors in the northern kingdom, but especially on the prophets Elijah and Elisha. I've colored in green main characters who are prophets. Again, we always want to keep in mind our 3 main sources of power in ancient Israel: kings, prophets, and priests. The prophets are in green. In red, you can see 2 significant priests. 2 Kings 11 through 16 are a unique 6 chapters in that a lot of time gets covered, nearly a century, and the kings are described in summary form. It is these 2 priests who are the most important characters. Both perform renovations in the temple at this time. Jehoiada performs renovations under King Joash. He also helps to install Joash as king. He helps bring order to Judah when the monarchy had devolved into a bit of chaos. And then Uriah, under King Ahaz, redecorates the temple after Ahaz goes and sees what the Assyrians had done up in Damascus. They had conquered that land at that time. So anyhow, 2 Kings 11 through 16 is a bit of an unusual block in the Book of Kings. Then in 2 Kings 17, we get to the really sad chapters. 2 Kings 17 is all about the fall of the northern kingdom, and you'll notice I've got 3 question marks about who the main figure is there. I want you to determine who you think the main character is in that chapter. Who is the main character when the northern kingdom is carried off into exile by the Assyrians? Then chapters 18, 19, and 20 cover King Hezekiah when the southern kingdom, Judah, is threatened under King Sennacherib of Assyria. Judah escapes, but barely. Incidentally, also, the prophet Isaiah is not only active in this section, most of this material appears also in Isaiah chapters 36 through 39. Then 2 Kings 21 vilifies King Manasseh. This long reign in the 7th century where Manasseh commits, according to the Deuteronomistic historian, commits great evil for which he will ultimately be blamed when the southern kingdom goes off into exile, all of which is accomplished in 2 Kings 22 through 25, but not before King Josiah becomes the major hero of the entire book. He suffers an untimely death despite what the prophetess Huldah says about his death. And then, of course, in the final 2 chapters, the southern kingdom reaches its denouement and is carried off into exile by the Babylonians. I do want to point out why I emphasize those 2 priests in 2 Kings chapters 11 through 16. The word priest, kohen in Hebrew, occurs often throughout the canon, and it occurs often enough in the Book of Kings, but not uniformly. Whole swaths of the book go without any occurrence. It's notable that they're mentioned so frequently in the middle of 2 Kings and with named priests. That's a bit unusual. There'll be some other places where the priests are quite significant, including the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings, and we'll look at that in just a moment. So let's move to our second stage. What inferences can we pull from the Book of Kings? Incidentally, you'll notice I'm referring to the singular Book of Kings rather than the two books of Kings, and that's because the original Hebrew only had one book. Indeed, the Hebrew tradition did not even know of two different books until the Rabbinic Bible published in the Renaissance. So that's a very late addition, at least to the Hebrew tradition. First off, I want us to look at the first two chapters and the last two chapters of the Book of Kings. Here we meet 5 descendants of David, 2 of his sons, Adonijah and Solomon, and 3 of his distant successors, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. Adonijah and Solomon are both sons with claims to the throne. While David is dying, Adonijah claims to be king, and he gets the support of Joab, the military leader we remember from 2 Samuel, and Abiathar, one of the main priests from 2 Samuel. Solomon, however, is able to get David's blessing as king before David dies, and so Solomon becomes king. He gets the intercession of Bathsheba, David's wife, and Nathan the prophet. Well, after David dies, Solomon has Adonijah and Joab killed, and has Abiathar the priest exiled to Anathoth. This is going to be important later on when we talk about Jeremiah. But Solomon becomes king, and before David dies, he gives Solomon a charge. Notice what he says: "Keep the mandate of the Lord, that the Lord may fulfill the word he spoke concerning me. If your sons so conduct themselves, that they may walk before me in faithfulness with their whole heart and soul, there shall never be wanting someone of your line on the throne of Israel." Is that what we heard back in 2 Samuel 7? No, the dynasty was unconditional. That "if" is a conditional particle. The dynasty has become conditional. And we're going to notice this denouement throughout the Book of Kings. We went from an unconditional dynasty to this conditional dynasty, to later on, when Solomon falls into disfavor, most of the kingdom is wrested from him, and then eventually even that is destroyed. So that's something to keep an eye on later on. Notice what Solomon says to Shimei, another man that he executed when he was consolidating his power. "King Solomon shall be blessed." He's talking about himself in the third person. "And David's throne shall be established before the Lord forever. And the royal power was established in Solomon's hand." The Book of Kings has a sense of irony. Kings has Solomon himself say that the throne will last forever. But as we all know, that's not what happens. In the last two chapters of the book, 2 Kings 24 and 25, Jehoiakim becomes a Babylonian vassal, but he rebels. After he dies, his son becomes king, and he is taken off into exile. He will be freed 37 years later, but it's too little too late. By that time, the kingdom has been destroyed, and that temple that Solomon had built at the beginning of the first book of Kings has been destroyed. All that occurs under Zedekiah, who is installed as a puppet king by Babylon, but he too rebels, and not only is he exiled, the Babylonians blind him after they kill all of his sons before him. One other important inference to make about the Book of Kings is the prominence of the different prophets in the book, especially an unnamed man of God who prophesies the coming of King Josiah, who again will become the major hero of the entire book. We'll say a little bit more about these scenes when we go into 1 Kings and 2 Kings respectively in our next two classes. So let's move ahead to our lingering questions. We want to ask the diachronic question: how did we get here? How did this text come into its final form? And we suspect that there were 3 main stages leading to a fourth. The 3 stages that led up to the final form we might call the source material stage. Kings is unique in that it cites a number of different sources, like the history of the kings and the Acts of Solomon. We think there are some other records there too. This led to a Josianic stage, a stage from the reign of Josiah, in which Josiah is the hero and it has a more hopeful tone, and then an exilic stage, which is the tragic story explaining how this disaster happened, the disaster being the exile. Later, after the Book of Kings attained its final form, the chronicler reflected upon it, as did Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities, as did later rabbinic and church traditions. One final question. We see often in Kings something like this. This is 2 Kings 24. "This befell Judah because." How did Israel understand the Lord? And especially, how did their theology of the temple and the dynasty intersect with this? We'll explore these questions in the future. Until then, read well and pray well.